welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. My name is Kate Fitzpatrick. I'm the Executive Director of the Deschutes River Conservancy. Our mission is to restore stream flow and water quality in the Deschutes River. We were formed 26 years ago to do this through collaboration. I do want to acknowledge that today is Indigenous Appreciation Day, and so it's really special for us. We were formed by the Warm Springs tribes, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and so their philosophy of collaboration, long-term stewardship, and good neighbor policy is at the core of who we are, and we're very committed to growing that partnership and continuing to strengthen how we can be allies with the Warm Springs tribes as well as all Indigenous people that are working to steward water over the long term. In that vein, I have a land acknowledgement. We honor the Native people who have called this region home for thousands of years. We join them in stewardship of our rivers for the next 7 generations. Before I jump in, I want to thank our sponsors tonight. We have City of Bend, Mount Bachelor and Sun Country Tours are co-sponsoring. We have Hand in Hand Productions that's doing our fabulous live streaming and recording. Open Space Event Studio, this lovely space. Patagonia, Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, Mount Bachelor, Rotary Club of Bend, and Wanderlust Tours. Thank you to all of our sponsors. So I am going to do this thing again. I'm not so funny, but I'm going to try to tell a joke. I got home tonight. I tried to feed my kid dinner in between, and my 12-year-old said to me, there's 3 kinds of people in the world. People that can count and people that can't. I was like, okay, so it inspired me to look up a joke. I think I might have had to write it down. Oh, how do you keep water in a hole in the ground until you need it? Well, I am so bad.
That's deep.
That's deep. In the case of our wells, they are often deep. So, but groundwater is a serious issue, and I appreciate how many people are here tonight to talk about groundwater. The Deschutes has one of the most unique groundwater resources probably in the world, I mean, honestly. And it's a really apropos time to think about groundwater because we've long had a management framework for groundwater in the Deschutes Basin, but it's sort of a partial management framework that's not focused solely on protecting groundwater. And the state of Oregon is undertaking a really interesting process of taking a hard look at how they allocate groundwater resources into the future. And I would just characterize it from sort of a reactive approach to giving out permits unless you could prove there was an injury or harm, sometimes with no data, to really flipping that and trying to understand how they can only give out permits if there can be proof that the aquifer is reasonably stable. So there was a public meeting 2 weeks ago. They're kind of doing a tour around the state. They're very curious in people's input in that. We're not going to focus on policy today, but I think that how they define reasonably stable will be a really interesting conversation over this next year, and having the technical background to be able to track that and provide input in that is what we hope that this seminar tonight will help with. So we don't have any policy answers per se, but we do have a wonderful technical resource here. Joe Kemper is a hydrogeologist for the Oregon Water Resources Department for the last 6 years. He's a native Oregonian. He lives in Bend with his wife and 2 kids, and he's joined us tonight to share his knowledge. And as always, we have our lovely Lisa Seals, our programs manager with the Deschutes River Conservancy, facilitating a conversation. So thanks again, and I will hand it over to Lisa to take it from here.
I get my own mic.
Oh, I can take this back.
Yeah, are we officially on?
We are officially on. That I know, that's quite a way to begin. Matt, should we do a little sound check, or are we good?
I'll get it.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Lisa Seals. Thank you all so much for being here. If you are just arriving, there are seats up here in the front, and don't be shy. I think people are willing to share tables. There's seats right here and seats right here. So feel free to come in and make yourselves comfortable. Before we dive in, I just want to do a few little housekeeping things. Well, first of all, how many people in the room are repeat offenders? How many people have been to a Raise the Deschutes seminar already? Okay, all right, I like it. Thank you so much for continuing to join us. That bodes well. I am curious, did anyone attend the very first one that we had in July on the topic of hydrology, or look online at all at hydrology? Okay, a handful of you. All right, good. We are going to do a little tiny bit of recap from that seminar just to kind of get those of you caught up. We also have our cliff notes, I think that we handed out at the door, so that should hopefully help. Other housekeeping things. We are going to do our absolute best to try to hold questions until the end. We know that you guys, I'm sure, have plenty of questions, but for the most part, we want to hold them to the end, unless they're clarifying questions. If we say something that's just gone completely over your heads, we're using acronyms and throwing them around right and left, and you don't know what we're talking about, please stop us. That being said, we have Jacob, my coworker, is going to be in the back of the room with a microphone. So before you start asking questions, either during the presentation or after the presentation, if you could wait until Jacob gets to you, that would be ideal. That's mostly because we have an audience at home streaming, as well as this is being recorded for future viewing purposes, and folks online can't hear you unless you have that microphone in front of you. So that's the housekeeping portion of tonight's show. And with that, I think we'll just dive in and get started. So let's see. Starting out, we just want to give you a little overview of what we're really going to talk about tonight. As Kate talked about, there's a lot of policy discussions happening in the basin tonight, but this particular talk is not so much about policy, or really isn't about policy at all. In fact, it's about how our groundwater system functions. So that is what we're really going to try to lay the foundation for everyone understanding, so that you can more actively engage in those policy discussions as they unfold in the coming months. We are also going to kind of try to give you a snapshot of what we know about the state of groundwater in the basin, again, based on science and data. So that is why we are here tonight, and hopefully that will make you all happy, and we can answer most all of your questions on those topics. So starting out, we have to start out every presentation with a map so we know what we're talking about and where we're talking about. This is a map of the Deschutes Basin watershed. The area in yellow is the upper Deschutes Basin, and we focused on that for a portion of our hydrology talk. But we are specifically going to be talking about that area that is outlined in black. So I'm going to let Joe explain why the area in black and why that is our focal area.
Yeah, so this kind of black squiggly shape here is what's known as the Deschutes Groundwater Study Area. The first of many acronyms that we will be throwing at you tonight. But this was defined, well, I'll back up a little bit. There has been, since kind of the mid-1990s, the Oregon Water Resources Department, the organization that I work for, that's OWRD, partnered with the USGS, the U.S. Geologic Survey, and did a cooperative basin study trying to gather as much information about the groundwater system in the upper Deschutes Basin. And anytime you do a study like this, you need to put some sideboards on where you're going to study. And so what was decided on is this black shape that you're looking at right here. And there's some hydrologic and geologic reasons that we'll kind of touch on throughout that, but we're going to throw that figure at you a lot. You'll see that a lot tonight. So, and as I'm saying that, I do want to acknowledge the incredible amount of work that's been done in this basin by a lot of other folks who have come before me. So folks at my agency in the USGS, the Bureau of Recs done a ton of work here. Lots of nonprofits have done a ton of work. All the partners in the basin. A lot of people have done a lot of work to try to gather data for us, so we know what we're talking about tonight. Because obviously there's guys that have been, guys and gals, like Ken Light, Marshall Gannett, Ned Gates. These guys have been working in the area for decades. And I just really want to acknowledge the work that they've done. I'm very appreciative for what they've done. They wrote it all down, which was also really helpful.
Yeah, and we're really lucky from what I understand, because that's not the case with every basin in Oregon or really across the West or the world. Like groundwater resources, I think, are not fully understood. And not that we fully understand everything, but we have a lot more information to go on than most other places. So I think That's phenomenal. But we are going to be focusing on the black shape. You'll see this same shape pop up in many of our slides, and that is essentially the upper Deschutes Basin study area. We haven't made a fun word out of that one.
Dogwassa.
Dogwa.
Yeah. Well, it's Deschutes Groundwater Study Area. Dogwassa is what I say in my head. So.
All right, we'll try to work that in or not tonight. Okay, so before we get too far into this whole presentation, we just want to do a little overview of what groundwater is and what we're talking about specifically. And I have to say, I went to graduate school in Florida. So when people talk about groundwater in Florida, yeah, exactly. They're literally talking about underwater rivers. That's what the image is. And so a lot of people get that image in their brain, like underwater rivers, and they do exist in a place like Florida with the karst geologic, with the karst geology. But that is not what we're talking about here in the Deschutes Basin. So I'm going to let Joe explain what we're talking about when we're talking about groundwater here. We don't have any underground rivers.
Yeah, so I mean, 99% of the time when we're talking about groundwater, it's water that's being stored in these tiny little pore spaces between sand, gravel, silt grains, or in little cracks in rocks. So yeah, there's a lot of times people have that sort of romanticized idea of this underground river that your well has drilled down to and is pumping out of, and that's extremely rare. So almost all the time, it's just these tiny little pore spaces that have water in them, and water is able to connect through those pore spaces and flow underground. In the Deschutes Basin, we have a lot of volcanoes around here. Our geology is dominated by volcanics. We've got big lava flows, big ash eruptions that have deposited ash around, and so that's kind of the pore space that's available to us has largely been laid down by volcanics and by some other river forces in the area. So.
Great. All right. So groundwater is a really important part of the water cycle. So you guys can all pretend that we're going back to, I don't know, elementary school. You guys probably saw something similar to this. So Joe, take us through how this whole interacts with the larger water cycle.
Yeah, I'm going to beat you guys over the head with this the groundwater system's all connected concept tonight. So yeah, we're here. This is a USGS schematic here that just kind of demonstrating the entire, all the aspects of the water cycle. And this is the first of many slides that will show you that the groundwater system, really anywhere, is connected. It receives water, predominantly from precipitation or from surface water sources, water that goes in through the ground and deeper into groundwater aquifers, and then it actually flows underground and then can pop out at different places, and that's why we see springs and that sort of thing. So it's really important to conceptualize groundwater not as sort of this other thing that exists underground and is static. It's part of this dynamic overall water cycle system.
Yeah, that's a really important part. Groundwater and surface water are essentially one source of water. They're not separate, although I feel like a lot of places in the world, they often get managed as such, but that is not true. It is all very connected. Another little tidbit for those of you that aren't familiar, we're going to throw around the term groundwater system. We might also say aquifer. Joe just said aquifer. It's kind of like talking about watersheds and basins. It's the same word kind of denoting the same concept, or different words denoting the same concept. So just to kind of keep you all on that page. So we'll keep throwing those terms around. And on the topic of terms, we got some vocabulary lessons for you before we get too far into the talk tonight. These are some really important concepts that we are going to talk about and then talk about again and then talk about again. So we wanted to make sure that you all are familiar with them. So Joe, you want to explain to us recharge, discharge, and how that impacts water budget?
Absolutely. Yeah, so a water budget is one of the most important tools in a hydrologist's tool belt, and essentially it's just sort of trying to put a number to how much water is moving around in whatever system you're drawing, right? And that's why we drew that that squiggly shape, because we gotta have a defined space to think about. And so the most simplified version of a water budget is basically just looking at recharge, which is water entering into our system. So for a groundwater system, that can come in the form of snow melting, or rain falling on the ground, that actually percolates down through the soil into the deeper groundwater system. You can have streams, actually. So you have a river, the Deschutes River at certain points actually loses a bunch of water to the groundwater system. And then one that's very relevant to the Deschutes Basin is canal leakage, right? We have long systems of irrigation conveyances, and water can actually leak from those down into a groundwater system. So recharge, water going in. Discharge is basically water exiting the system, the groundwater system in this case. Right, that can come in the form of, like, that is literally what a spring is groundwater coming up to the surface. You can also have water, groundwater that wells up into a river through the riverbed. So those are examples of natural discharge. Wells are another example. You drill down, you drill a well down into the aquifer system, and you put a pump down there, and you can pull water out of the groundwater system. That's all types of discharge coming out. And so, and there's, I have up there evapotranspiration. So when the water table's shallow, plants can actually grow down and access groundwater itself. Phreatophytes is the name for those plants. It's like a bonus word for you to use later.
There'll be a test later.
But really, like, it's a really useful framework to kind of think about what's going on, really in any hydrology scenario, but here in particular, because we have something coming in and something coming out, and we want to think about the balance of that flow. So if recharge and discharge are roughly equal, we say that system is in equilibrium or dynamic equilibrium. We would see same amount of rain and snow coming in, the same amount of stream flow coming out, and water levels are going to stay relatively the same in your storage system, in your aquifer. But if there are changes to those ins and outs, you might see changes elsewhere in the system. So if we have more water coming in recharge, say if we have a bunch of wet winters, we might see water levels rise in the aquifer, or we might see more surface water popping out from springs. Conversely, if we start seeing increases in discharge or decreases in recharge, we might see aquifer levels dropping, or we might see less flow coming out of that spring. So, as we think about a system like this, we're trying to put numbers to these things to try to understand why they're doing certain things. So it's a way for us to kind of isolate each of those pieces and think about it as a big system that all interacts.
Yeah, I think probably the best analogy I can think of for this, for something that you're probably all familiar with, is your bank account, right? Recharge is your income and the money that's getting deposited, and discharge are those withdrawals. So you want to try to keep things in balance, but oftentimes, you might get a lot of recharge, in which case you've got savings and that bank account's growing, and then on the contrary, you might have some big expenses, and all of a sudden that bank account starts to shrink, and the water budget is very similar. But we're going to throw around recharge and discharge for the rest of the evening, so hopefully that all makes sense to everybody. All right, so this is going to be, I'm going to do a little teeny tiny bit of recap from our hydrology talk a few months ago. There are a couple major factors that are impacting water in general in the basin, hydrology, and in particular groundwater hydrology. One is precipitation, and so up here I have a map showing the distribution of precipitation across the basin. And as you can see, most of the water that's falling or entering the basin is falling in the Cascades, where we might have more than 80 inches of precipitation in a given year. As you start to move farther east, that number goes down. So you can see that this has we're going to talk about how this has pretty profound impacts with regard to groundwater and just hydrogeology in general. And I love this map. I'm like, everybody always teases me because this is one of my favorite maps, but this is a map showing all of the surface water in the state of Oregon. What do you all notice about the center of Oregon? The central Oregon part. Is there a lot of surface water there? No. It's very interesting. I feel like this tells a really interesting story, so I just keep throwing it back up there. But yeah, this is just denoting that we have very little surface water in central Oregon, and that is really related to our volcanic geology that we're going to talk a little bit more about. And this, of course, has profound impacts on on groundwater. So, and just for reference, there's the fun squiggly groundwater study area that we are focusing on, and you can see, again, not a lot of surface water. The big line kind of running through the center, of course, is the Deschutes River. Both of those things kind of add up to give you this beautiful map, which I'm going to let Joe talk about, but this is our introduction to recharge in the basin. So Joe, tell us about what's happening with recharge.
Right, so remember how I was giving a lot of praise to the folks who did a lot of work in the basin before me, because I'm pointing to all the figures that they've created and all of the wonderful publications they've put out for. So this figure comes from a 2001 USGS report that is an estimate of recharge to the groundwater system in the basin. So what that means is that we saw that precipitation figure before, that's what's falling on the ground. And that recharge is what's going into the ground, past the root system, and into the groundwater. And so it actually, you can see it follows a pretty similar pattern as that precipitation figure, that we have, the lion's share, really dark colors, meaning high recharge, all along the Cascades. A little bit on Newberry down there in the lower right. But you have an incredible amount of recharge along the Cascades. Then again, as you move east, very, very little. I mean, you're getting less than an inch of recharge, in the Madras, Redmond area. So pretty stark contrast there. But remember that blue map that we were just looking at that had very low density streams in the basin, right? We just have a couple big main streams. And if you think about, most mountain ranges you walk around, there's tiny little streams everywhere. If you're like Cascade Range of Oregon, you get tiny little streams everywhere, but that's not what you see when you walk around here. And that's because we have incredibly permeable soils and rocks under the ground. So when that water hits the ground, it's not running off, it's percolating down into our groundwater system. So it's sort of, oh yes, perfect. So again, 2017 USGS publication figure that we're looking at. We are looking at, it's a type of geologic map that's supposed to depict the major hydrogeologic units in the basin. So I will explain what the heck that actually means. The geology of the basin is much, much more complex than this. There's all sorts of these interlobed and overlapping lava flows and ash flow tuffs and sedimentary deposits here. But these are lumped together in ways that have different rock units that have a similar history and similar permeability. I know this is kind of broad brushstroke for folks who are real nerdy about this stuff like me, but you see this term permeability. You might have heard the term hydraulic conductivity or transmissivity. Each one of those has a very specific technical definition, but they all kind of speak to the same thing: how easily water can flow through rock. And so here, we're looking at the colors here in our squiggly shape. The first one that probably pops out is the pinks. So that big pink section are recent volcanic units, both mostly from the Cascades and then also from Newberry volcano. A ton of the rock that you see right at the surface around here is from Newberry, from little cones around Newberry. But generally speaking, younger volcanic deposits are pretty permeable. The older they get, the less permeable they get. But we have really permeable geology at the surface, especially right around where we're getting all of that precipitation, right? So we've got young volcanics getting rained a bunch on, water goes in. Good? Okay, the brown, there's the light and dark brown, and then the blue units there. So again, broad brushstrokes here, but this generally refers to the Deschutes Formation, which is this super thick sequence of slightly older volcanics and sedimentary deposits, about 4 to 7 million years old. When people say, "Oh, we have this big, thick aquifer underneath Bend and Redmond," this is kind of what they're talking about, the Deschutes Formation. And again, it's a super heterogeneous formation, But in general, we're kind of able to lump them together and say, okay, these things all kind of act the same as water's flowing through them, and so we're able to kind of consider them as one big system. You can tell that I'm not really a field geologist.
You don't have your rocks with you.
Yeah, right. I don't have my rock hammer and my Brunton compass right now. But so then one layer further, you can see the green stuff kind of in the northeast most portion of the Dogwassa, the study area here. So one of the main parts of this green piece is what's called the John Day Formation. So this is what forms much of the Ochako Mountains, and it's older volcanics. We're talking 30, 40 million years old. That stuff has largely weathered to a lot of clay minerals, which are relatively impermeable, so much less permeable than the other rocks that we've been talking about. And so that is there's a really, it's very laterally extensive, but it actually dives underneath the purple, brown, and pinks that we're looking at. So we have this permeable stuff, young, middle, and then old underlying those other permeable units. So so we have all this recharge occurring right along the Cascades, and then we sort of laid out the hydrogeologic framework for the groundwater system here.
So what I'm hearing you say is that basically this combined with precipitation essentially equals that recharge map.
Mm-hmm.
So the two things interacting is how we get to the recharge. And I think our next figure is a really cool figure that is a cross-section of this that helps kind of show how this all interacts with surface water added in there. I love this one. It's got a lot going on. This is one of my favorites.
But it's worth unpacking.
It is, yeah.
All right, so let's walk around this one a little bit. So the kind of aerially, we're looking at the Three Sisters in general. So this is, and I would say this cross section right here, right, we're looking through sort of like a slice of the earth. It is sort of like a generalized. I would not say that that's exactly what the land surface looks like. It's not perfectly. It's sort of a conceptual model. We often refer to these things as conceptual model. It's a great way to understand how the system works. But so we're generally talking Three Sisters area up there, top left. And then we're walking all the way down through Sisters, the town, and then we've got the Deschutes and Crooked Rivers just before they hit Lake Billy Chinook. And then, right, we've got all sorts of precipitation, rain and snow falling on the Cascades, and that's going down into our groundwater system. And we have lots of flow. See, those lines are kind of indicating how groundwater is going to be moving through here. And we see those arrows moving from our recharge down through kind of the flat areas where we see most people living. And then, right, we have our John Day Formation, the low permeability rock kind of underlying this whole system.
And you can see right here, what's interesting is that the arrows sort of change direction here as they hit that John Day Formation, right? So all that water is moving in that direction, but then it hits that layer where it's not permeable, and that's where it's kind of forced upward. So, yeah, and you can physically see this not all over, but in very specific places. So this is a really cool aerial photograph of both the Deschutes River on the left and the Crooked River on the right.
Well, I totally stole it from Google Earth, but.
Well, yeah, we stole it from Google Earth. He stole it from Google Earth. But it is, here's a quick little reminder, the Deschutes River flows from south to north. So we're looking down river right now, which I know is a little confusing, but, and you can see you've got pretty drastic increases in flow as you start to go downriver. Same thing on the Crooked. So Joe, yeah, talk to us about what is happening here with regard to the permeability and groundwater in those different formations. Yeah,
right. So we've got, slightly different, we have totally different dates for these for the two data sets. But that's just because we have the three for the Crooked River, the green boxes, we have gauges right there. And then the blue boxes, we have a set of seepage runs that was done right during all that work that was done in the mid-90s, sort of laying the groundwork for all this. So so different dates, but basically the same thing is going on between both of these things. So right around Lower Bridge on the Deschutes, kind of on the bottom left there, right, we have 50 CFS, and as we see, right, and then it's also nice to have our little cross section there, right, and so we have groundwater starting to come back up towards the surface as we have the topography of the basin generally diving towards it. And then these two rivers have actually are incising down into that bedrock. They're eroding down into those rock units. So then we have the groundwater system upwelling into those rivers. And so we see these really, really impressive increases in flow, right, over just a few miles from Lower Bridge to Steelhead Falls. We're picking up 170 CFS. Wyches Creek, between Steelhead Falls, we pick up Wyches Creek, and then the actual Deschutes River gauge above Lake Billy Chinook, they're picking up another 250 CFS through there. Because you also do get some big springs right at the very bottom of Wyches Creek. And then the same thing is happening, but even in greater magnitude along the Crooked River. So that 40 CFS is right where Smith Rock is. And I took these flows off our gauges online on the last day of the water year. I thought that was pertinent. But then, yeah,
which
right.
means the last day that folks are irrigating, right? That's the end of the water year. So, yeah.
And then by the time we get to Crooked River Ranch, that 97 CFS, we've picked up, we picked up about 50, 60 CFS. And then by the time you get below Opal Springs, we've got 1,200 CFS. So you've got over 1,000 CFS just coming up into the Crooked River, that is a very rare thing when people kind of talk about this uniqueness of the Deschutes Basin. It's a pretty impressive thing that's happening, and largely out of the view of the public, right? Like, not many people see that, so it's it's fun to be able to share that. So, and we have. I was poking around online, and someone took this wonderful drone footage taken off from Crooked River Ranch going down into the canyon. And you see, so that bottom photo is where they've gone down into the canyon, and you see these huge springs spouting out from the canyon walls. And it goes like that. There's tons of those as you go downriver. So it's really cool. You got water coming up into the Crooked River bed itself, and then shooting out from these springs as well. So nice little visual, right? And like that top photo, you kind of get a sense of the expanse of that spring network.
Yeah, so normally you would think about, or I think about rivers adding flow as they get closer to the mouth. When you think about more rivers and tributaries kind of hitting the river and the river growing, but here you basically have a river that's growing and it's all from groundwater inputs, or largely from groundwater inputs, which is really pretty incredible and unique. And I don't know if I have not had a chance to go and visit Opal Springs, but Opal Springs is one great place to see this kind of action. You can also, if anybody's ever been up to the headwaters of the Spring River or the Fall River in the upper Deschutes Basin, or the Metolius. I don't know if anybody's ever boated the Metolius. Again, they're excellent examples of watching the water just literally come right out of the ground into the river system. And that's also happening underwater as well, places we can't see. But yeah, it's really impressive and really incredibly unique. All right, well, moving along to this very complex diagram that we debated whether or not to include, but we feel like it's we have time, and yeah, this is kind of, for those of you that came to the hydrology talk, we talked about what a hydrograph is, which is sort of like a foundational piece of understanding flows over time. And so this, at the end of the day, we decided was really important to show you, because this is how hydrogeologists understand what's going on with groundwater. And so we're gonna walk you through all the different lines and arrows and dots and kind of try to explain basically how this works, and it's gonna be quite related to all the things that you have already heard. So I think we'll start with the lines that look. How many people are familiar with topographic maps? Okay, good. Wait, great. You guys are already passing the class. So this is a lot like a topographic map, except for underground, right? Yeah. So so that's all these lines. You got all these lines and these contour lines, and they're denoting elevations of groundwater. And similarly, I mean, groundwater flows downhill, so to speak. It's flowing from higher pressure areas to lower pressure areas. Do I have that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And then that is denoted by the arrows.
Yes.
Correct?
Yep. Yeah. So I guess, and I throw in a caveat here. So we're pretty much everything that we're talking about today is about kind of the big regional groundwater system that we have here in the Deschutes Basin. I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of little pockets here and there of shallower systems, maybe these like little local like stream influenced sort of like mini systems, and they are not as well documented, not as well, I guess, widely understood. And I know there might be some questions about that later, but these figures that we're really talking about, we're talking about this big regional system. So I want to make sure that I put that out there too. So yeah, as Lisa was saying, we've got, right, it kind of looks like the contour maps that you're probably familiar with denoting topography. But these are made basically by a ton of boot work, boots on the ground, going out there, finding wells, and getting measurements of water levels. So you got to go to a well, you note the location, the elevation, you put your probe down there, find how deep the water level is, and you do that for hundreds of wells to build a map like this, because you're able to compare water elevations from a bunch of different data points, and then you can kind of extract what you're looking at here. Again, tons of work has been done preceding me in this basin, so it's a really cool data set we have. And like Lisa was saying, water generally flows from high pressure or elevation towards lower pressure elevation. And so we see those arrows are going perpendicular across the contours, and it's because water is generally going down slope, down gradient. And so I know in those previous slides, we were kind of painting this very simplistic picture of how groundwater is flowing, but I think one of the takeaways from this one is it's really complicated. There's a lot going on. And again, this is just a generalized, this is a generalized figure from the basin, from the groundwater system here. I'll also point a couple things to point out too. We see the steepest contours largely coming off of the Cascade range, right? Like that's where we're getting a lot of our elevation and our recharge there. What are the little blue dots? Those are wells that were measured or field located during the initial Deschutes groundwater study that was done in the early mid-90s. So that's someone who had to spend basically their entire day going out and figuring out where that well is, accessing the well, making sure that the landowner is okay with it, getting that measurement. So really incredible amount of work went into creating something like this. It also, you might notice that those wells are clustered in very particular ways, and that's where people live. So we've been kind of talking a lot high level about about how the groundwater system works. Also thought this was kind of a nice way to segment and talk about how we fit into this picture, right?
Indeed, yeah. So up to this point, we pretty much have just told you how the system works in the absence of all of us, but of course we all know that we have our impacts. So we're gonna get into the portion of talking about pumping and how pumping impacts this whole picture. So, you wanna talk about your quote?
Oh yeah.
This gets back to the bank account.
Indeed. Yeah, so, and I'll point to our little simple cartoon here. This is just kind of I know this might be sort of eye-rollingly simple to some folks, I apologize, but when you drill a well and you drill down into an aquifer and you put a pump down the well, what really happens when you turn that pump on, it starts pushing water to the surface. And that water has to come from the aquifer to meet that demand of the pump. And so water level drops in your well, and then water in the aquifer starts flowing towards your well, right? We have to create a gradient for water to flow from the aquifer into where your pump is. And so what that does is create a cone of depression, and that's what we're looking at, sort of a cross section here. We see our little dashed static water level line where it was before the pump turned on. You turn your pump on, water starts creating that cone of depression in the aquifer. And so we often point to this wonderful quote from Charles Vernon Tice, who was a really foundational hydrogeologist who put down some of the first math that really paved the way for modern hydrogeology, modern even in 1940. But I mean, breaking it down, he made this point that all water discharged by wells is balanced by a loss of water somewhere, right? So when you turn your pump on, it isn't like we've been pointing out all day long that it's part of a water cycle. It's part of the overall budget, and so that water that's coming out of the ground is part of that system. And it's just a point, well.
Yeah, it's just like not having a credit card that's attached to a bank account. Yeah. Not just being able to continue to make withdrawals without it impacting that bank account.
That's how I behaved in like my early 20s, but
right. Just, indeed. All right, so then can we go on to the next one? All right, we're going to talk a little bit about how this impacts not just the groundwater, but also, in many cases, the surface water. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I kind of think about this in my own head as sort of like the no free lunch principle. And so I'll step you through a couple of these schematics here. Again, this is sort of general groundwater hydrology that I'm going to be talking you through. Not unique to the Deschutes Basin, but it's a super important concept about groundwater that I think everyone should be really aware of. My wife is a surface water hydrologist. I'm always like, what about groundwater? She's like, So, okay, our top figure here, figure A, we're looking at an unconfined aquifer, just sands, gravels next to a stream, and we see these arrows denoting the fact that there's a gradient pushing groundwater towards that stream. Now, kind of in your mind's eye, like if you walk outside the Deschutes Basin and you're walking around in some mountainous area and it's August and all the snow is melted, there's no dams above you, and there's water in a stream. That's groundwater. That's water that's coming out of the groundwater system into a stream, and it's coming out there at a time when there's really no other water available. It's when water is most scarce, is that base flow that we referred that to. So we've got our base flow scenario there in figure A at the top. So then we throw our well in there, right? We drill a well into that aquifer. And you turn the pump on and you start drawing water into your well. And right from the beginning, we might see that water really starts just coming from what we call storage. That's water just in the immediate aquifer right next to you. You've got your cone of depression. You're taking water predominantly just from what we refer to as aquifer storage, right? We see those arrows just pointing straight to the well. But if we keep running that pump longer and longer, you'll start taking water from the groundwater system that would have otherwise discharged to surface water. We refer to that as stream depletion or capture. And you can see that, in kind of our figure B here, where you've got those arrows that are then being interrupted by now our cone of depression. And so, like we've kind of been harping on this, it's all connected, and this is how a schematic of how that really happens. There's also a big timing component of this too, because you might turn on your well. You can turn on your well, and if you're 5 miles from a stream or you're a mile from a stream, you're not going to see these impacts right away, because groundwater is moving at slower timescales than we typically think of. So you might turn your well on and you can run it for 10 years and maybe you're not going to have any impact on surface water. But eventually those impacts will start decreasing base flow. And when you turn your well off, even if you stop pumping, well, you've already created sort of like a hole in that aquifer system. So maybe we didn't feel those impacts for the first 10 years, but then over the next few decades, then those impacts are going to really start manifesting themselves in that base flow and that groundwater contribution to surface water. So I think there was Kate mentioned the Oregon Water Resource Department is doing sort of like initial stages of reassessing how we hand out new water rights, how we allocate new groundwater rights, and we're really trying to focus that process on how groundwater impacts surface water. So another whole can of worms. But yeah, so worst case scenario in a stream depletion, sort of like the chronology of the stream depletion. The bottom one, we've reached what's referred to as full capture, or even we're inducing through flow from the stream into your well. So we don't really see that, like that's not really like what's happening right now, but I just kind of walk you guys through, what we kind of think about when we think about groundwater and surface water.
I know this is not directly related to what we're talking about, but we use the term unconfined aquifer. Do you want to talk a tiny bit about what that is versus like a confined aquifer?
Sure.
Okay.
Oh man, how textbook do we go end members and like the gradient?
High level.
Kind of like textbook. An unconfined aquifer or a water table aquifer is basically we have the most common instance where you've just got like sands, gravels, and that if you dig down, a few tens of feet, you're going to reach what's referred to as the water table. So it's called unconfined because there's nothing confining it on top of it. But you might have a scenario where you have that unconfined aquifer, and then you could have a 100-foot thick, super low permeability clay layer that's laterally extensive. It goes all over. But then there's older water that's entered maybe up in the mountains. There might be a permeable unit underneath that clay layer, and that's confined by the clay layer that you're talking about. So,
and those would probably be pretty hard to like with recharge. Those would be, I would imagine, in general, a confined aquifer would be incredibly slow to recharge.
Much slower recharge. Yeah.
So, all right, thank you. I just figured since we've thrown out those terms, we should define them. So it sounds like OWRD, the Oregon Water Resources Department, has done a lot of work on just monitoring groundwater. I mean, that last schematic with all of the lines and things showed all the wells and all the data that you guys have been collecting. So we have a pretty good data set and understanding of what's happening in different parts of the basin with regard to groundwater resources. And I think at this point, we're going to kind of walk through different parts of the basin and the data that they have collected and see what's been happening. And I think we're starting in the Sisters area, which is, if you guys recall, right up against that recharge area in the Cascades. So. Yeah,
we'll throw this map at you a couple times. So there's many more wells than this, right? We saw those blue dots in the contour map earlier, but sort of prograded a few of our longest record wells that will be able to demonstrate sort of the trends that we're seeing. So these purple wells right here, we've got the red circle around. Right, we can switch over to the hydrograph. Here's water levels that have been measured in some of those wells, basically from about 1960 for the oldest record going forward. And a couple things to note in this hydrograph. So I'm going to show you similar hydrographs a couple different times. So we see these blue bars on the bottom. That is water year precipitation. And so the little dash line shows you the mean precipitation, the average in that climate center or climate area. And so it's really helpful in the Sisters area to see those because you can see that groundwater levels actually are responding to wet and dry cycles in the climate. Right, so maybe in like the mid-late 90s, you see a bunch of wet years in a row, and then you see this increase in groundwater levels, this rise in groundwater levels, and then you get some dry years, and they slope off. And so most of those wells are, we don't really see big declines in the Sisters area, right? Like these water levels are just kind of doing their thing, following those wet and dry natural climate variability cycles. So I will point to the little red ones on the bottom, right? The yellow and the green, we see an increase, in the mid 2010s. We don't really see that much of a bump in the red well. And I'll point out that the red well is the furthest east, so furthest away from the recharge zone.
That's so way. Whoops, sorry, wrong button. Oh God. Help with technology. That's this guy right here?
Yep.
Okay, all right.
Deschutes 2929.
Of course. Yeah, that one. Oh, yeah.
That is one of the city wells, I believe. 57902, I think.
I love that you know that right off the top of your head right there. So, yeah. So this is really interesting. In looking at this, this is, you can see that, again, going back to travel time, it takes some time for the water to fall from the ground and then make its way through the groundwater system. But because these wells are essentially tucked up really close to the Cascades range, like that travel time is shorter. So you can see how it follows that precipitation map or precipitation chart, which is not necessarily the case in some of the other areas, or it's not as clear cut in some of the other areas. So I think we're going to Lower Bridge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so red dot, green, or red circle, green dots. There's a bunch of different water level records in this area. I've selected ones that have a good long record, but also can be plotted together because we either plot by depth to water or by elevation. So.
And kudos to Joe who plotted all of this for the slideshow tonight.
Okay, so in this hydrograph we're seeing, so water levels don't really start until mid-90s. And we see since then, right, like until early 2000s, there's a little bit of decline. And then since, early 2000s, like in that green record, we see a pretty steady, about a half a foot year decline in that area. Some of those other records, if you look at the red one and the blue one, you actually see a little bit of a bump in response to some of those wetter years. The blue record, we actually did see a little bit of a recovery in the spring this year. But again, like several different wells showing just kind of this slow, steady decline in that area.
All right, and next we are going to the Bend, Redmond, and Butte area.
Mm-hmm. Yep, red circle, red wells. Here, so green record is going back to the 1970 approximately. And here we see, it's a similar picture where we have, in the last few decades, we're seeing this slow, steady decline in water levels. In this, it's kind of hard to tell with the vertical axis keeps changing between each of these hydrographs because of graphing constraints, but here we're seeing about a foot a year, more, plus or minus in this general region of the aquifer. So again, we see a little bit of, there's some response. Maybe the decline will slow a little bit a few years after a wet period. You might get a little bit of a bump here and there, but on the whole, in the last few decades, we've seen sort of the slow, steady decline in this area.
And this area being farther from the Cascades and the recharge area,
That's
we're
right.
not seeing that direct relationship where it's pretty quick, where you got recharge and then all of a sudden you see that in the well. It's a longer travel time for that water.
Or there may not be as much water covering that distance as well.
Too, yeah.
So.
All right, and then last but not least, we're going to South County to the Lapine area, which is also tucked up closer to the recharge area. So.
Yep, so we've got the red record is pretty long here, going back to, almost 1940. Again, we see some of those decadal cycles, water levels, coming up about 10, 15 feet, falling just kind of in response to regular climate patterns. But then in the last, 5 or so years, we're seeing declines that are going past what we've seen before in the past. So. They're falling about half a foot to a foot a year. But that's just in the last 5 years.
So just for clarification, you guys are going out and actually measuring these wells?
Us, shout out to Ned Gates at the Oregon Water Resource Department. He's been someone who's just been slow and steadily getting so much of this water level data. Yeah, there's a bunch of folks who work on this kind of stuff. Folks at the USGS are operating some of these wells as well. So.
But again, this isn't anything that's just like telemetry and you guys are getting, nope, you're literally going out and getting all the data. Yeah. It's an impressive body of work for sure. And then here's a summary of all of them on the same y-axis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, it's just so you can kind of see apples to apples here. We see, those top wells, those are the ones that we looked at in Sisters. And then we see our lower bridge, the orange and the green data set there. That's that lower bridge, about a half foot a year decline. And then we see that lower set is that Bend, Redmond, Powell, Butte area where we've got about a foot a year. Just wanted to pause.
All right. So then I know a lot of people then are scratching their heads and trying to figure out, myself included, like what is causing this? And we have some information on that, yeah. So let's talk about what information exists or what studies have been done to kind of help parse out why declines are happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a pretty natural inclination to say to wonder why this is happening at all, right? And so first, I'm going to unpack this map a little bit. There's a lot going on. So we've got we see Highway 97, the black line going from Bend, bottom left, up to Redmond, kind of in the center top right, and we see, so there's these purple dots, and those are wells on water rights. And they are sized according to how big the water right is, basically. So the higher permitted rate, the bigger the dot. So we have, one of the influences in our system, right, is pumping, groundwater pumping. Next, so we see that we've got the big blue squiggly line, that's the Deschutes River. And then we also have these other smaller lines, and those are canal reaches. So those are irrigation conveyances that stretch all across this basin, delivering water. And they're, let's see, the red portions are sections that we know have been piped as of 2016. So, right, that there are some updates to be had about that data set, but essentially what we think about there is that there's, before those were piped, irrigation conveyances lose about, in this basin, it was estimated about 45 to 50% of the water that travels through those canals actually seeps through the bottom of the canal and can go down into the groundwater system. So it's a good chunk of water. And that has been recharging the groundwater system in the area. So we have pumping, and we have pumping that's been increasing, and then we have canal lining that has slowed some of the recharge into the groundwater system. But then we also have had a relatively drying climate over the last two decades. We're seeing less recharge, less precipitation coming into the mountain ranges, and less recharge into the groundwater system. And so I've referenced two groundwater scientists before, Marshall Gannett and Ken Light, and right as they were, as the study team who started looking at the Deschutes in the 90s and 2000s, they started writing up some of their initial reports and documenting how well both surface water, like Fall River, and groundwater levels were tracking with climate. And it looked like climate was strong. We just had enough precipitation, enough recharge that we could use groundwater and everything, groundwater levels wouldn't decline. And then you see that the publication date, Gannett and Light 2013, as we march forward a little, we see some declines persisting through the basin, and these guys wanted to know why. And so one of the products that came out of the Deschutes groundwater study was a mod flow model, a numeric model. So it's a big mathematical system that estimates how groundwater flows through the system. And you're able to ask a model sort of different scenarios to try to tease out questions like this. And this report that they put together estimated that of the declines that they saw up until 2008, just west of Redmond, about 10% was canal lining, 25% was from pumping, groundwater pumping, and then reduction in recharge from climate was contributing about 65% of that decline. So it's complicated, right? There's a lot of different influences into this system. There's not really one single answer or single finger to point at anybody.
We do have our climate, this guy.
Yeah, and so I guess so. What we're looking at here is the longest continuous record of precipitation in the Cascades, or in the Oregon Cascades at Crater Lake. Again, slow shout out to the people who just every year went out and maintained this precipitation site gathering these data, because they're really, really valuable. And there's actually, what's not pictured here is a bunch of years before here, precipitation was measured kind of in some incomplete chunks. There's some missing years that date back to the 20s and I think 1919. But for completeness, I put up this record here. The dashed line is, again, our average precipitation through this time period. And then our red line is if you just put a basic linear fit to these data. It shows that we're generally getting less precipitation at Crater Lake over since the last 70 years now. And so here we are in this position where we've got declining groundwater levels and increasing demands for water in the basin. And we've got pumping, we've got canal projects, canal lining projects that are part of really, really important surface water conservation measures, right? Typically those canals are being lined to be able to put water back in the stream, so that's also a very important thing that's going on in the Deschutes Basin. But there are side effects to that, right? And we also have had, in general, we had a dry period. We didn't. What's not pictured here, because our record ends at 1947, is we had a big dry period in 20s and 30s. That's the Dust Bowl. So, we had a little bit more water in the 1950s, but then kind of slowly since then we've had some good chunks late 90s. But in general, we're seeing less water coming into our basin here, and so. Right, between canal lining, groundwater pumping, and climate, none of those things appear to be getting better, at least if we're looking back this way. I will say that climate projections from global climate models actually predict a very small increase in precipitation for the state of Oregon. We're talking like 3 to 6% by 2080.
But that is also combined with increased temperatures.
Yes.
Yeah, and those increased temperatures, then you have increased evapotranspiration. Forests and other, are using more water, so it's kind of it's catch-22. And I don't know if anybody has a working crystal ball. Let me know.
Yeah.
I'd love to know what's in store for the future.
Absolutely.
But yeah, climate models that's the best we have at this point.
And I'd even add that estimate, right, is for the state of Oregon, and that's not every single basin, and it's hard to tease out what's going to happen to every single part of Oregon, right? Like, I've done a lot of work in the Walla Walla Basin, and we actually have seen that the Blue Mountains up there are getting this string of above average precipitation for the last 5-10 years or so. So it's not all the same thing.
Right.
So
meanwhile, the Klamath is seeing less and less precipitation. The Hood is seeing more, so it's pretty hard to parse out. But I think one interesting thing to note about our basin that again, going back to us being super unique, is that a lot of basins across the West are really dependent on snow as being quite literally the reservoir for water resources going into the summer. And so in those basins, if there is an increase in temperature and less snow is falling in those basins, that means less storage, like literally less storage available. In our basin, we're somewhat in an admirable position, because whether it falls as snow or rain, most of that water is percolating into the ground. And so, not to leave you all with we're totally fine. Nobody, there's no concern at all. But we are I think in a better position than a lot of basins, because we have this pretty profound natural storage that exists, and it's not necessarily tied specifically to the snow. So at least that's my high-level understanding of it.
No, I think there's definitely a lot to that. I would agree with that, yeah.
All right. So with that, I just wanted to roll back around to the key points and the takeaways for all of you guys tonight. The big one is that groundwater and surface water are one source of water. So again, it's like one bank account. We can't draw on one without drawing on the other, and so we need to manage as such. And I would say on my little soapbox that probably all basins should probably be considering that, not all basins across the world. And as we know, like as Joe pointed out with all of his amazing graphs, there are some declines around the basin, and as far as we know, climate change is the primary driver for those declines at this point in time. And then, of course, we have recharge, and that recharge is happening in the Cascades, in those areas with higher precipitation and higher permeability. You get higher recharge. And again, that is a lot being discharged in the northeastern part of the basin near Lake Billy Chinook, where it hits that John Day Formation, those less permeable layers. Of course, there's all sorts of intricacies that you can see in all the maps and charts, but that is the high-level summary of what we were hoping you guys would get from this evening. And I think, unless you have anything else to add, we can probably go to questions. And you guys have been so quiet.
I know,
no
right?
clarifying questions, no comments, no peanut gallery. Like, are you guys still awake out there? Okay, so at this point in time, glad you're all still awake. Jacob is going to be our MC who's going to walk around with the mic and hand it off to folks who have questions. And I assume there might actually be some questions online as well. So, Jacob, what have you got for us?
There are a few questions online. And before I ask those questions, I will just say that these slides will be available later for those who are interested. So don't worry, you'll be able to see these again.
Yes, we will post them online.
So there's been a couple questions waiting. The first one that I see here is somebody wants to know about the aquifers. And so we've talked about decline in terms of feet and inches, but can you tell us about that in terms of percentages? Like how much year over year, percentage-wise, have they declined?
Is that an online question?
Indeed it is.
Okay, I think the question, right, is in terms of percentage, we're talking about the amount of the thickness of the overall aquifer versus the amount of declines that we're seeing. And so the thickness of the aquifer, right? Oh, thanks, whoever just...
I just did that. That was
magic.
Me.
Perfect. Yeah, what I didn't point out in this slide, I meant to point this out. So we have a rough elevation scale on the left-hand side there. Those are in thousands of feet. And so we don't have a well that's drilled all the way down to the John Day Formation in the middle of the basin at Redmond, so it's thick. We've got wells that are, approaching about 1,000 feet, and we still haven't hit the bottom there. So in general, the water table is really thick, or the saturated thickness of our regional aquifer is very, very thick. So it might be 1,000 or more feet, and so we've only seen about 20, 30 feet in the last 20, 30 years in that context. And that's a very, very fair point to make.
So what is that, 0.2? 0.02? Somebody do good math.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. 20 divided by 1,000, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, and it's, there's plenty more aquifer down there. I'd also say, so it's, well, yeah, I won't go. That's
so yeah.
Perfect.
It's a small percentage.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. There's another question online that I'll let Kate paraphrase here.
And I hope I paraphrase it correctly, and if I don't, online person, let us know. I think it goes to the point of canals being lined and piped reduces recharge, but is there a bigger picture to look at? And the answer is yes, because when you think about those canals, those are all diverting surface water from the river at pretty significant impacts to the river habitat. So when you can, and so we sometimes, I don't know if this is correct or not, but we sometimes call the 700 miles of canals and their seepage into the groundwater sort of artificial recharge, because it wouldn't have been there under natural unmanaged conditions. So in that case, you are reducing recharge to the aquifer, but you are gaining back the flow that would have been in the river in the first place. So it just kind of underlies the complexity of needing to manage surface water and groundwater as one resource.
Yep. Yeah, I'll add to that as well. I mean, those 700 canals that were dug across Central Oregon, hand dug across Central Oregon, have been in place for about 100 years. So in the grand scheme of things, when we start to talk about the geology and the hydrology of the basin, like those were they're artificial, to Kate's point. And so while they are having impacts, while lining and piping is having impacts, the canals themselves also have had profound impacts on our water resources. And in fact, any of those of you that have your cliff notes, you can look at from the earlier presentations, the slide, there's a hydrograph that shows how the Deschutes River has been impacted in terms of diverting those flows. And yeah, and there's the winter-summer flow diagram as well that kind of helps show the impacts to the river. So, so yeah, of course there's no perfect answer, but those canals are we're not here 100 years ago. So
And sorry, the second part of the question that
Oh,
I
yeah.
forgot to specifically answer is when those canals are piped, by and large, 100% of that water gets returned to the stream and protected from diversion. So you're having a direct stream flow restoration impact from that activity.
exactly, and therefore you will have the recharge as it was 100 years ago before we started building canals, essentially. So, yes, Jacob.
All right, some questions from the audience now. We'll start here in the back.
So we're seeing obviously a steady decline in groundwater as far as its availability or its height, and it's causing more wells to be dug deeper to get to it. Is there a formula or a method to forecast when the critical point of capture starts to occur within the river systems themselves? So I'm not sure if that makes sense. So you showed the graph with the A, B, C, D, and then you start to see capture from those surface water areas. Is it possible with the data that you guys have currently to model where those critical points start to occur, where you do start to see capture?
Yes. So one of, and this was, there's a couple scenarios that were modeled and documented in some of these USGS reports using the basin scale numerical mod flow model, where you can put a well in your model and tell it to pump. So the scenario in the report, they had a well start pumping at 10 CFS. And make sure I get these numbers right. So the well, one of the scenarios, they put the well around the Redmond area, and let's see, after 5 years, I think, basically in the first like 10 years, we start seeing over half the water is starting to impact surface water. And those impacts were mostly seen in the Crooked and Deschutes rivers down low. So if you're pumping from deep in the aquifer, you drill deep down lower in the basin, in the Redmond area, you start seeing, pretty appreciable impacts. Within 5-10 years, you're getting past over half of stream depletion. So water not coming from that aquifer storage, but actually impacting discharge into those streams. So it happens on fairly quick timescales in the basin.
And Joe and Jonathan, I'm going to look to you, but what we've done to keep it not so complex is we haven't talked about the Deschutes Groundwater Mitigation Program.
Right.
But that was actually designed to protect stream flows in that recharge area. So under that program, if you're, for example, a city pumping new groundwater, you can only do that if you offset that use by restoring senior water rights in stream. So to some extent, we have a management framework to mitigate some of those impacts. They don't mitigate all of the impacts on the actual groundwater storage in the upper basin. So I'm just wondering if you want to say anything more about that, or anyone else in the room.
It's a great time to talk about that too, because I know the Deschutes Basin, the upper Deschutes Basin, actually is way ahead of the rest of the state in the fact that it has a functioning mitigation program, right? So it's the mitigation program is a very complex thing that hopefully we can have a chance to chat about maybe later in this seminar series. But essentially, if you apply for new groundwater right, the basin rules, because of the work that was done in the Deschutes during the groundwater study, they basically acknowledge the fact that groundwater use will impact surface water. And so to get a new groundwater right, you have to find a surface water right and make sure that water goes in stream, knowing that that groundwater use would have impacted surface water.
So
There's
you have
a
to
lot,
make a deposit.
lot of nuance
deposit
there.
to the bank account in order to be able to, so that we don't influence surface water.
A lot of nuance, broad brushstrokes, but
Yeah.
essentially that's how it works.
We could have a whole seminar on groundwater mitigation, and who knows, maybe we will if you guys are interested enough to come back and hear about groundwater mitigation.
All right. One more question from online before I move to folks here in the audience. We had an individual who just wanted you to clarify a bit the difference between snow versus rain precipitation. I guess there's some sort of implication that they're very similar, but in some folks' minds they might be different.
Well, what is it? 1 foot of snow equals an inch of rain,
Ish.
roughly?
Ish. Well, it depends on, like, snow changes a lot when it's, right when it falls, that's going to have its maximum air content. But as you go out through the season, it compresses, and so you get less and less air in there. It's more dense. But I mean, with respect to the groundwater system, it's just water going into the groundwater system. It doesn't really matter. Well, I should say, when precipitation falls as snow, it can affect the timing, right, of when that's going to impact the stream hydrograph. A little bit in terms of the groundwater hydrographs that we see around here, because we'll see when we get our snowmelt really starts kicking up in the springtime, we actually do see a measurable response in wells that are close to the Cascades. So it matters a little bit in terms of timing, but in terms of just H2O in the ground, there really isn't much of a distinction.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think the timing was the crux of the question there.
Yep.
All right, so questions in the audience here. I saw a bunch of hands up here at first, so I'm going to start with this individual over here.
Yeah, thank you. Would you mind going back to that why are groundwater levels declining slide?
This guy?
So what really stands out to me is this is data from 1997 to 2008. Has anybody tried to update this? What do these numbers look like today, 15 years later?
No, we haven't yet. And it's definitely something that we would like to take a look at. Especially even, I mean, it takes a lot of groundwork just to estimate, effectively estimate how much this stuff has changed over time. And so it's certainly acknowledged that it's something that we're going to want to update because, yeah, right, you said the publication was in 2013, but the data set was ended in 2008. So certainly something we'll look at. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'll also couch that in, so the Oregon Water Resource Department and the USGS, there's a long history of cooperative basin studies where we kind of have moved around the state, the Deschutes Basin, the Klamath Basin, the Willamette Basin, most recently the Harney Basin, and now the Walla Walla Basin. We've done these cooperative studies with the USGS where we do this comprehensive kind of work. And so a lot of that work has been done in the Deschutes, and that focus has kind of shifted around the state. And most recently, a lot of that work has been done in Harney. Like I said, it's being done in the Walla Walla right now. And like I know it sounds like a cop out, right? You know where I'm going with this, right? There's a capacity issue, right, to do this kind of work. And so it's something that I would really, really want to get updated numbers in front of folks. But it doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
So.
And we knew we were going to get questions about this, so we had to include the best available science that we had, and this is the 2013 report with that data set. So, yeah, but it's on the radar for sure.
Another question here.
Thank you for this. It's great. I think I got half my question answered. I had a time question. Your favorite slide that had that map, that blue map with all the, you know what I'm talking about? It was your favorite.
The one, this one?
No, keep going.
The surface water map.
You said it was your favorite one, so you got to keep going
Pretty
back.
blue map.
Oh, this
Yeah.
guy. Love
Now
this guy.
go
Okay.
back one more,
Okay.
right before that one. Maybe it was two more. I don't know. Now I'm losing track. But my question really was: it was a slide and it had groundwater H2O. The date was 2001. It showed the number of wells from 2001. So between then and now, 20 plus years, ballpark percentage increase in wells. If you had to guess.
It's been, let's see, I don't have the numbers right on hand for you,
Yeah,
but there's been a
ballpark.
fairly linear increase in groundwater wells. Actually, no, I'm not even going to speak to it. I
Okay.
don't have that specific
All right,
number
so
for
there's
you.
a possibility that the amount of discharge, proportionate to the amount of recharge, has been significantly impacted in the last 20 years just because of that.
There is. Should we show the exempt
Oh,
wells
yeah.
data? Yeah. Okay. So we have.
Here's the data that I do have prepared for
Slides
this.
in back pocket for questions such as these. So bear with me while I scroll through the whole slide. Everybody close their eyes so they don't get dizzy.
Well, thanks for going back. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so again, going back to the groundwater mitigation program, there is a program in place. If the city, for instance, wants to pump groundwater, they have to mitigate for that by essentially finding surface water rights that can be put in stream, right? So that's what's happening with new groundwater rights,
okay.
correct? But at the same time, there are exempt wells in. This is the state?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the state. An exempt well is basically a domestic well. So anybody wants to build their little ranchette and they have to drill a well to do that. They're allowed to do that without going through the groundwater mitigation program, right? So I think you're speaking to the fact that there has been a lot of growth around the county and the state in the last 20 years. But this bar chart, I think, does a really good job sort of summing up, again, best available data that we have at this point. The blue bars show the percentage of wells, like the actual number of wells, right? So 88% of the wells in the state are domestic wells, meaning they're exempt from, in this case, the groundwater mitigation program.
It's your house well.
Your household well. The rest of the ones listed there have groundwater rights. And in the Deschutes Basin, correct me if I'm wrong, everybody in the audience who knows more about it than I do, or Joe, help me, those guys would need to get permits, and they would have to mitigate for their usage. But
it's really let's see, livestock. No, the other ones would still be under they would be exempt from needing a groundwater right. Because livestock is exempt, industrial is exempt up to a certain point, but
not irrigation.
The irrigation wells, right? The point here is that only about 7% of the total wells drilled are irrigation wells that are on water rights. And again, this is statewide, I will acknowledge that. But if you look at the estimated use between domestic wells and irrigation wells, we're talking 90% of the water pumped out of aquifers is from irrigation wells. And then we have 90% of the total wells drilled are household domestic wells, but less than 5% of water pumped out of aquifers is estimated to come out of those wells. So if we're talking about like the amount of staff time to devote to investigating the big budget items, we're looking at the smallest number of wells that are producing the most amount of water.
Got it.
So,
and last, and I'll let you guys, trying to get the data updated, is that both boots on the ground and money, or is there other issues involved?
And staff time.
yeah.
Staff time is a big piece. And there's also, I will also add that there are some new tools using remote sensing, so that's aerial imagery, that are starting to come available, that's able to do a much better job of estimating water use, water applied to fields that we really hope to use. We're starting to look, it's been used a little bit in the Harney Basin study. It's going to be used in the Walla Walla Basin study, and it's just staff time to get to do that work here too.
I mean, the changes speed up, the information's got to speed up too to make decisions, right?
Yeah. I also want to point to one of the graphs in your handouts too. There's a pie chart there that shows you the distribution of water rights in the basin, and that I think also sort of is another way of looking at this type of information, right? In terms of the quantity of water, like there are a ton of exempt wells, but they're using just a tiny sliver of the water, similar to how in that pie chart, it's a blue and green pie chart. You have, if you look at the municipal slice, it's a pretty small piece of the pie. But yes, there has been an increase in the number of wells drilled. So,
All right, in the interest of moving on a little bit here.
Thank you. Lisa, I think you said 100% of the water that from the piping and pressurizing program will go back into the river. You want to expand on that?
that was Kate's comment, and I don't know, Kate, do you want to take it, or do you want me to talk about? Okay. Yeah, currently there are projects afoot across the basin when all the different irrigation districts are going through the process of acquiring federal funding to do pretty large irrigation piping projects. And that water is saving, that is saving water. And that water that is saved, that would otherwise be going in the ground, is being, for the most part, put back in stream, meaning like that water right. For those of you that have come to earlier sessions, we talked about the way that water law and water rights work. Those water rights associated with irrigation diversions, for the most part, are pretty old water rights. And so those old water rights will get put back in stream, or actually not ever taken out of the stream. So, and Becky is shaking her head, but Kate, do you want to elaborate?
I know, we got to talk, Becky. This is on. Yeah, the largest projects that are happening, 100% is being restored in stream based on the seepage loss from that particular project.
But some of the piping projects, they say 23%
Yeah, well, there's a lot of complexity, but I would say that most of the water from almost all the piping projects in the basin has been restored in stream. And under the state's statute that governs this, which is the Allocation of Conserved Water statute, even if 100% of a project is publicly funded, they only require 75% of the water to go in stream. And many of our districts have been putting 100% in stream. Now, of course, there's a range of the seepage loss, right? And probably districts are taking the conservative end of the range because you don't know. But we actually have an example of an irrigation district, Swally, that overcommitted water in stream, and they're still trying to make up from that. So there's some devil in the details around the fringes, but by and large, our irrigation districts are putting really most of the water back in stream, and we have hard data to show that, and I'm happy to sit down and share that with anybody. And I don't want to go backwards, but Jen has some data on exempt wells and the Deschutes that she felt was important. Oh, is it important? Okay. Jen says it's important, so we're going to hand her the microphone for a minute.
I'm Jen Hubert. I'm the Senior Program Manager at the Deschutes River Conservancy, and I manage our groundwater mitigation bank that we run. And so I keep tabs on kind of the mitigation and wells, new wells for the basin. And so new wells since about 1996 have been conditioned for mitigation. And the mitigation program started around 2002, really officially in 2005 with legislation. But so this chart here that you're looking at shows irrigation being the highest percentage of use in wells, and that might be the case in the Deschutes Basin. But for new wells, 90% of the rate of water, the CFS of water pumped out of the ground, is actually quasi-municipal and municipal since around 1996 in our basin, just based on the mitigation program in that squiggly study area that we have.
Thanks,
so
Jen.
just a little clarification on that.
All right, thanks, y'all. And just in the interest of time, I will say we have time for just one or two more questions, but please feel free to stick around and ask us questions afterwards, or always feel free to contact us if you have pressing matters.
I do have a pressing matter, just kidding. My question B is not a question, but it might be for everybody after this first one, which is for Joe with the agency you work for, and Lisa and the Deschutes River Conservancy. What roles do these two agencies have influence over for certain types of agricultural or residential developments in the city, in the county, or in the basin in general? Do you have any say in what goes or doesn't, and what the future of this region looks like based on groundwater use?
You want to take that one?
Sure. So when I can speak to this, when an applicant comes to the department and wants a water right, there's a whole process, right? If you've ever applied for a groundwater or a water right in general, these things take a lot of time. It's a public process as well. So I'll kind of speak to that, how that happens. And you apply, and we do what's called an initial review on your application. And that will look at, each basin, administrative basin in the state has basin rules. And those basin rules speak to what each one is kind of custom to the basin, and a lot of different uses are allowed or not allowed in a certain basin. And so you can look those up. They're all online. They're very dense and boring to read. OAR-690-009-0040, like one of those kind of things. But they're really important, and they're really powerful. And so every time that someone applies, part of that is looking at what use is allowed in that basin. Another part of that review looks at, is there water available, whether it's surface water or groundwater. And so one of my roles at the department is to do a technical review on for groundwater applications. So we look at water level trends in the aquifer. We look at adjacent water users. We look at impacts to surface water. So we take a lot of the data available and these concepts that we've been talking about into account and try to estimate what this proposed use is going to do to what's going on in the ground already. So there's all these hurdles of what's legally allowed, what water is available, what data we have to evaluate a new water right application. I would also say that it runs off of the prior appropriation system, and so if applicant A comes in, a day before applicant B, and those are for very different uses, if those uses are if those are allowed in the basin rules, this person A is senior to user B, and there really isn't like an evaluation of public perception of those two uses. So it's is water available, is that allowed in this basin? Again, it is also a public process, so people are able to comment on those things. There's opportunities for the applicant to protest maybe how we review an application. There's opportunities for the public to comment on those sorts of things or to claim that we didn't do our process correctly. So there's comment and there's legal sort of venues there to look at those water rights. So that's kind of an overview of the general process of what our shop does.
But I feel like the short answer is yes.
Yes.
Yes. And I also just want to do a quick little.
Should I have just said yes?
No, I think that was
That
way
could've been.
better. Now people understand how it works, which is way more important than just yes. But I also just want to flag this, and Kate mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, but the Oregon Water Resources Department is currently going through a process of evaluating potential rule changes for how they give out new water rights, not existing water rights, but new groundwater rights. And so there was, as Kate mentioned, a listening session that took place in Bend a couple of weeks ago. I believe it's online. It's streaming online if you guys wanted to see the department's presentation and some of the comments. But this is open to public comment right now. I mean, essentially, the reason why we're not talking about policy right now is because policy is literally being formed and talked about and debated as we speak. So that's why this is a great primer for you all to take away, hopefully, what you've learned tonight and be able to comment with some background knowledge about how the groundwater system works. And I think specifically the two questions that are on this slide, which is what is the time frame and physical distance should be used when considering impacts to streams, which gets to one of the questions that we had in the audience about like that distance and time frame, and how do we reasonably define stable groundwater levels? As we noted, like as Joe noted, the aquifer here is deep. It's 1,000 feet or more. And we are seeing declines, but what is reasonably stable? And as a society, what do we want to say? How do we want to answer that question? So, so this is an excellent opportunity for you all to have your voices heard, and you can chime in and make comments that the department will take into consideration as they're forming these groundwater rules. So, I would encourage you to.
Point of clarity.
Yeah.
I think previously you had said, at least as far as Deschutes is concerned, it's oversubscribed already. So we're talking about groundwater.
We're talking about, yeah.
For new water rights, we're talking about
groundwater rights.
Taking it up as opposed to taking it out.
Yeah, groundwater rights. So yeah, the Oregon Water Resources Department is, and I should have written, groundwater rights specifically is what is being talked about. And this is also a pretty profound shift in policy overall in general. I'll just take a little history lesson. From my knowledge, most of the time when entities, and I'm not pointing specifically at OWRD, but I'm saying in general when When we had a dearth of data, when we didn't have data about how much of a resource existed, the default historically, like through our culture, has been, let's issue the right. We don't know, so go ahead and take the water because we're not sure. But I will say that this new discussion and this policy is actually really flipping the switch on that and using more of a precautionary principle where they're saying if we don't have data, we're not going to issue the right. So that's a pretty profound change from how things have been done historically. So I just want to make you all aware that that's happening, and encourage you all to please comment. And I think we have, I don't know, another. Do we have time for any more questions, Jacob? There's a question in the back.
I thought there was one question up here at the front. Okay.
So many questions.
They're all over the place. I guess let's start with you, because you're standing right next to me.
Well, that was convenient. My question is on measuring discharge. In this basin, we don't measure water coming from wells or going to water rights. How valuable would that be if the requirement was to start measuring the discharge?
You're talking about specifically domestic wells.
Yeah. And would that help inform decision making?
That is a good question. It depends on who you ask.
And so the question is specifically how pointed towards measuring domestic well use.
And irrigation. And irrigation.
So
there's reporting on that, yes?
Yeah, couple different answers there. So for any new water rights that we're really issuing now, that the Water Resource Department is issuing, will typically have a condition on their permit to put a flow meter on their well and record their use and report their use to the department. And so that, there's a lot of old water rights that really wasn't a part of the conversation. And that's specifically for wells on water rights. I know that concept it's really important to draw that distinction between wells on water rights versus household exempt wells. And I think to your question about the utility of putting meters on water right or on wells that aren't on water rights, I think the reason why we often we point to that slide about the pure number of wells versus the estimated use speaks to the amount of work it would take for someone to put a meter on all those wells, to collect the data, to make sure that data is high quality, to store those data, to do quality assurance on all that, and then turn it into something useful, right? Like big utility companies, like your power meter, they get paid by the kilowatt hour, right? And so part of your utility bill goes to putting that meter, having folks come out and check that meter, and that really, we don't pay, if you have a water right or you don't have a water right, you don't pay for the amount of water that you're using. It's waters of the state. It technically belongs to all the citizens of the state, but you're not charged on a volumetric scale like that. So it's certainly a possibility, but it would take considerable logistics and money.
Yeah.
And we often we couch that in like the overall estimated use, like how much, the overall size of that bite of the pie versus the amount of work it would take. Does that make sense?
But that would also be potentially a good comment to include. I mean, because again, we're talking about new groundwater uses, and so now is the time to throw out that information that would be something potentially that you'd like to see, if that is something that you'd like to see.
But clearly that graph you showed, it's the irrigation that's using
Right.
the water.
And those are water rights, so those are being monitored and being recorded.
And that was initially for farming, and now it's so much more than farming to have those rights. People, the city of Bend and parks, I mean, the amount of water that's used that they don't pay for. And it seems like that's the big chart, that's the big use, is that irrigation.
Yeah, just for scale numbers, irrigated agriculture diverts about 740,000 acre feet a year. The estimated use of exempt domestic wells is 6,000 acre feet a year.
Yeah.
Not that we shouldn't pay attention to it. For example, there's a development proposed that would sink 710 exempt wells in one development that don't need a water right. We should probably pay attention, and measuring everything would be great. But to
Right.
Joe's point, there's a a capacity issue. So it's all important, but there is a scale consideration.
Got back there in the back, we got a hand up.
Waiting patiently. Thank you.
Bruce looks so polite over there.
I know.
Hi. I just wanted to ask because I was watching the slides and climate is such a big variable. And I want to know about your understanding of the data set. And I know you're not a climatologist, but I'm going to ask you because you're up there.
Totally.
Have we ever seen conditions and flow conditions in the basin based on the data set in the historic record?
Sure.
I mean, yeah, you've mentioned that in the 30s in the Dust Bowl, we had a really bad time. And then in the 40s and 50s, it got much wetter and water levels came back up. And I do believe, as you said, this is the cycle that we're in. And a lot of it's driven by climate. So you just have to be careful to make sure that it feels like that is such a big driver and we can't control that.
Right.
It's not climate change, that's climate variability.
Yeah.
So, because the climate change itself, as you mentioned, would be, maybe a little bit wetter, maybe not, about the same maybe. So I think it's interesting to see the historic record. I wish we had data that went back further.
Right. Climate is the elephant in the room. And again, crystal ball out of commission. So if anybody has one, let us know. But yeah, that's the really hard thing to plan around is we have seen these ups and downs in the period of record with wetter and drier periods, but it's anybody's guess as to if the climate models will be right and how that will play out on the ground. Yeah.
No, and it's a great point that you do make, and I think some of that recent work. There's been recent work done that has shown discharge in Fall River, which is classically the climate indicator stream in the uplands and the headwaters of the Deschutes Basin, that compared pretty low flows in the Fall River in conjunction with the Dust Bowl era low precipitation, and certainly we've been in dry areas before, and we also have these the groundwater level declines that we're seeing right now, and I certainly hope that we hit one of those. We have a wet period. Like I don't want there to be less recharge coming into the system for sure. I would really like that. It'd be great if we got enough of these wet years to bring those declines back under control, and it'd be great. But I also think that there's that climate variability that we've seen in the last 100 years. But then we also do have increased CO2 that appears to be very drastically changing the global system, right? And there's new variables in the climate that are being introduced, and so I want to recognize that historic variability that's been documented, and we're also trying to be wary of uncertainty in the future.
All right.
I might just, I'm just seeing people feel like they might want to leave, but we're still going on. So you're welcome to stay and talk to any of us. We'll stay, but if you want to leave, we'll formally close the program. I just want to share really quickly the DRC vision. And I know there's capacity concerns, but we have a pretty significant aquifer, and we're very lucky to have that. We're seeing declines. We are aggressively piping canals to restore stream flows, and we have growth and development and the desire for new groundwater pumping. I think specifically the cities that have a mandate to plan for projected growth. Destination resorts is one thing. Cities are a bit of a different animal. So it's not easy, right? And so what we hope to do at the DRC is support and provide funding for data that allows us to have a tool to understand what's happening in the basin, update the information, and conjunctively, which means together, manage surface and groundwater, project scenarios, like how many canals do we want to pipe, what are the impacts, how much groundwater pumping is estimated where, what are the impacts, just so that we have the information to make good decisions as a community, because none of it's easy with water in the West. So that's our vision. We have great conversations going on at the state. We have obviously a lot of technical resources and expertise. I feel like we're really lucky that way. And I'll just close it out and say thank you so much for being here. And if you want to stay and ask questions, you can stay right here, and we'll stay right here. But if you want to leave, please feel free to do so.